Hi, thanks for coming back. In today's episode, I'm going to take the boxing animation that I got from Mixamo in a previous video, and I'm going to add it to the Sandbox character. So go ahead and check out that video if you'd like to follow along. Otherwise, if you already know how to do that, here we go. Okay, so let's go and retarget this animation. Let's right-click the animation and select Retarget Animations. And let's select the UEFN for our target skeletal mesh. And you'll see that they're both using the Fortnite humanoid for the source skeleton, which is interesting. But that will work in our favor. So let's select the boxing animation and select Export Animations and choose a folder to export it to. And now once we hit export, we have our animation. And we want to create an enumeration that will keep a list of our fighting stances. So let's go to the data folder and go ahead and create that. We want to right click and it will be a blueprint class enumeration. And let's go ahead and name it E fighting stance since they already have a stance enumeration. Go ahead and open that up and let's add a couple enumerations. One will be neutral and the other will be boxing. And then you could add more here if you'd like, like sword, nunchucks, whatever. And let's go back to our sandbox character and open that up. And now we want to create a variable that reads that enumeration that we just created. And we'll name it fighting stance. And then for the type, we'll just type in E fighting stance or whatever name you just named your enumeration. And now we want to create an input that will switch stances. So we want to go to the mappings, which is it's the icon that has multiple controllers. And we want to create a input that uses a bool, like a crouch or a jump. So we'll just copy crouch and we'll rename this IA change stance. And then we'll re-click on the mapping and we'll add this IA change stance. And we arrow that down, and then I'm just going to use the mouse wheel up. And it's a good idea to add a gamepad trigger to this as well, but I don't know what gamepad triggers are being used, so I'm not going to do that right this second. So let's go back to our sandbox character blueprint, and let's now call on that input we just created, change stance, IA change stance. Let's click on that arrow to expand it, and we want to drag off of started. And we want to drag out the fighting stance. We want to get our fighting stance and we'll just see if it's equal to boxing. And we'll pull that off into a branch and pull the started into the branch. And if we are boxing, then we want to change to neutral. And if we aren't boxing, if we're neutral, then we want to switch to boxing. Now this would be a different setup if you had more than one. I can do that in the future if people would be interested in that. But for now, I just want to kind of show the ability to get a different stance into the animation blueprint. So let's get into the animation blueprint. Okay, and you see that it's already grabbing a sandbox character reference. So let's go ahead and just get that reference. Let's search for sandbox character. And let's drag that out. And from that, we will get our fighting stance. Okay, and from that we want to pull off of the fighting stance and promote that to a variable. And the APB will basically, whatever our sandbox's fighting stance is, our APB fighting stance will be the same. Okay, so let's go into the anim graph of the animation blueprint. All right, and we're going to want to add something in front of the default slot, this default slot node where we add montages. We're going to add something right before that. We're going to add an animation layer and then an overlay is another term that I've heard for this. So we want to create an animation layer, hit the plus sign, and we'll name this fighting stance overlay. and we want to add an input to this. This will be an input pose, and this is the pose that's coming in to the nodes, so that will be everything before the default slot. Okay, if we drag this out, we're going to plug this in. So the input pose is right, that everything that's being plugged into. Okay, and the output pose is, you know, everything that's coming out. Okay, so in there we want to cache this pose. So drag off that and type in cache and new save cache pose. We want to name that main pose. Okay, and now we want to call on that main pose. So we'll right click and search main pose and use cached pose main pose. Alright, and now we want to type in fighting stance because we want to blend this based on the enumeration, and on the active enum value right click that. We want to change the binding to be the fighting stance, and that's the variable we created earlier from dragging off of our sandbox fighting stance. Right click the default pose and go find boxing pose, and that will add another pose to this enumeration. You saw that neutral was there as well, but for now we're just, the default pose is the neutral pose. Okay, so now we want to get another main pose cache, so we can just duplicate that. And now we want to go ahead and grab our animation, our boxing animation, so drag that into the graph, and then we want to make sure it's looping. Okay, because this is just for a fighting stance. So we're going to layer these. So we want to layer blend per bone. Okay, and we're going to drag the boxing into the blend pose at 0, and then we're going to drag this into the boxing pose. Compile. And now on the layer blend pose, we want to, in the later setup, we want to add an index to the branch filters, and we want to just name that pelvis and put the value at 0. Okay, and if we use mass wheel up, we can see that the stance is there, but our legs are not doing well. And I'm thinking when you're running, you're not going to probably have your fists up, so I'm going to create a bool that's going to check if we're running. But before that, let's go ahead and add another index, and we're going to go ahead and filter out the neck. So let's go ahead and copy the lowest neck bone, and let's paste that under the bone name. And then we're going to go ahead and for blend depth, we're going to put -1, and that will make it so we're not going to be using the neck from this boxing 2 animation. We'll be using our mouse so we can look to the left and right like I just showed you. Okay, so let's go ahead and only do this if we're standing still. So let's go ahead and drag this off, and from this end of this node we'll blend pose by bool. Alright, and we're going to be using this bool to check our speed if it's greater than 0. Let's go ahead and disconnect this, move this down, because we're going to connect this to the false pose, because if our speed is greater than 0, we want to use the main pose that came into this layer, you know, our default pose essentially. But if we're standing still, then we want to show our stance. Okay, so now we want to get our speed, get speed 2D, and from that we want to check if it's greater than 0. Okay, and then we're also going to check if we're in the air, so also check for, get an or boolean, and then we're going to create a new variable, connect that to the active value, and then we're going to create a new variable, call it falling, and we're going to plug this in there. So if we're jumping in, or if we're moving, we don't want to use our boxing pose. We want to just use our default pose. So let's go back to the event graph where we added this fighting stance variable. Let's get the character movement reference, and from that we'll just check if it's falling, and from there we're going to set falling to this value. Okay, so just drag set and set falling to this falling value. Okay, and that way When we're jumping, we won't have the boxing stance, and when we're moving, we won't have the boxing stance. All right, let's check it out. All right, let's jump. Let's move. It's snapping a little too fast for me, so we can change the blend speed. I'm going to go ahead and do that. So in the blend posed by bool, true blend time, I'm going to put the 0.5, and false blend time, I'm going to put the 0.5 for a little bit of a smoother transition. Okay. All right. All right, well, stay tuned. In the next video, I'll show you how to add punching to this stance. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you then. Take care.